Well, we've had a big victory recently. A number of major car companies had announced that they are pulling AM radio from new cars, and that is an enormous problem. That is a really bad decision. If you look nationwide, there are roughly 4,500 AM radio stations all across the country. About 82 million Americans listen to AM radio every month, and pulling AM radio from cars does enormous damage. And so I joined together with Ed Markey. Ed Markey is a liberal Democrat senator from Massachusetts. Ed may be the most liberal senator in the entire U.S. Senate. I'm the most conservative senator in the U.S. Senate. It is rare that Ed Markey and I are together on a bill, but we joined together on a bill to require that car companies continue to provide AM radio in the new cars they're selling. And that's important for a lot of reasons. It's important as a matter of public safety. If you look during emergencies, whether it's hurricanes or tornadoes or floods, AM radio is the most reliable means of communicating with people. Often when you have a disaster, power lines go out, power goes down, FM radio goes down, it takes higher power, and AM radio is the means of communication of the last resort that Americans in distress rely upon to get life-saving information. But beyond that, AM radio in particular is an oasis of talk radio. We have seen conservative talk radio stalwarts rise up, from Rush Limbaugh to Sean Hannity to Mark Levin, and millions of Americans listen to talk radio. Frankly, I think that's one of the reasons why the car makers were eager to pull AM radio out of their cars, is that I think part of this is an effort to silence voices with which they disagree. And I got to say, we introduced our legislation, and within 4 days, Ford Motor Company, one of the biggest car companies in the world, reversed course and announced it was going to include AM radio in all of its vehicles. And so that was a big victory to begin with. But we're going to keep pressing till we pass this legislation, because consumers ought to have choice, ought to have the ability to choose to listen to AM radio if that's what they want to do. But the argument the car makers made, this initially started with just electric vehicles, and they argued that AM radio interfered. There was interference between AM radio and the electric wiring. Well, it turns out there's a fairly simple fix in terms of shielding that wiring that's not terribly expensive, that enables AM radio to work just fine with electric vehicles. When this was limited to a handful of electric vehicles, it was not that significant a problem. Now, number one, we're getting more and more electric vehicles on the road, so that's becoming a broader problem. But number two, car makers were not just limiting this to electric vehicles. They were pulling AM radios off of their internal combustion engine vehicles, their gasoline-powered vehicles as well. And so it was becoming an industry move that within a few years, millions of consumers would have cars that couldn't get AM radio. And that, I believe, was an enormous problem. And so what this bill does is it requires that car makers provide AM radios and let customers decide, let the consumers decide. You know, there are Texans all across the state. They're farmers and ranchers who in rural communities rely on AM radio. Sometimes it's the only radio you can get. They rely on it for crop reports and weather reports. They rely on it when they're out in the tractor. That's what they're listening to. And there are also communities, smaller communities. You know, one of the great things about AM radio is it has a very low barrier to entry, so that if someone wants to go up and put up a radio show, it is relatively inexpensive. It is much less expensive than an FM show, which takes much higher. An FM station takes a lot more power, a lot more equipment. It's a lot more expensive. What that means is with AM radio, you have many more voices, and in particular, you have voices in individual communities. So you have stations that focus on issues in the African American community. You have stations that focus on issues in the Hispanic community. You have stations that focus on issues impacting Asian American communities. That diversity of views is good for the country. House Republicans and the House as a whole voted to pass the deal. That was not terribly surprising. You saw a whole bunch of Democrats support it, and you saw some Republicans support it. I think at the end of the day, the White House got a lot more out of this deal than Republicans did. This deal gives $4 trillion in new debt. That's a massive amount of new debt. And it does so in exchange for very modest spending reductions that I think are too small to make a material difference fixing the problem we have. Look, some basic numbers. 2017, 5 years ago. In 2017, the entire federal budget was about $4 trillion. Federal tax revenues were about $3.3 trillion. Now that means, doing quick math, that the deficit that year was about $700 billion. What happened from 2017 to today? Well, the federal budget exploded. COVID was the excuse, and then you had a Democrat Congress and Democrat president that went on a multi-trillion-dollar spending spree. And so now, 5 years later, the federal budget has gone from $4 trillion to $6.6 trillion. That is a massive increase. Federal tax revenues, even though we passed the big tax cut in 2017, remember Democrats said tax revenue would plummet. Turns out they were wrong. What they told the American people was flat out false. Federal tax revenues went from $3.3 trillion to just under $5 trillion. So federal tax revenues went through the roof because the tax cuts produced economic growth. But the problem is spending is now much, much higher. If we had limited spending, we'd have a surplus right now. But the Democrats didn't want to limit spending. And what happened to the national debt? In 2017, the national debt was $20 trillion. Now it is $32 trillion. And with this deal, it is going to be $36 trillion. That is nearly doubling the debt in just a few years. That is profoundly reckless. If you're pissed off at the inflation you're paying right now, when you go to the grocery store, when you go to the gas pump, when you pay your bills at the end of the month, the reason is the Democrats are printing money and borrowing money they don't have. And this deal should have done much, much more to address the underlying problem. This is a big missed opportunity. And unfortunately, as Joe Biden is crowing, this was Republicans agreeing to fund every one of his left-wing priorities. I think that was a big, big mistake.